can a lover go but to the land of his beloved? And what seeker findeth rest away from his heart's desire?
Thank you. So we are back in Europe with Dorothy Baker. She had started in Scotland. I think we spoke a little bit about that. And after Scotland, she went to Birmingham, England, for the British National Teaching Conference. At the time, the British Baha'i community was small and conservative. But Dorothy, the chairman of the NSA of the US, won their hearts. Her effect in inspiring the believers to arise for the success of their plan was very notable indeed. She spoke of the Guardian, and her theme was, if you love the Guardian, there's nothing that you wouldn't do to please him. So the National Teaching Committee of Great Britain wrote to the NSA of the United States to sum up her trip and her impact in that part of the world. She said, Mrs. Baker's visit meant something very special to our national community. Appreciation is not confined to the committee, but is warmly felt up and down the land. Great as was the value of her teaching work, however, by far the most remarkable and permanent contribution grew out of the providential opportunity for her to participate in our annual teaching conference. The conference is one of the 3 rallying points of the national community during the year, and for the past 3 years has marked a significant turning point in the affairs of the cause. In a sense, Mrs. Baker's presence and contribution were a pivot for the whole proceedings of the conference. After the reception was held, at one point, was attended by 85 people, including 50 non-Baha'is. And you realize that she says that while the attendance of the teaching conference was the highest on record, averaging about 75 believers, you realize that this is more than a third of our national community, every assembly and goal town being represented. Thus, it is apparent that the beneficent influence of Mrs. Baker's work has gone out to all parts of Britain. Her work will long be remembered, and we feel sure that she has done much to knit even closer the bonds of Baha'is following fellowship which unite our 2 national communities. Now, she was going from place to place. She went to Spain after that and spoke to small groups of 4, 8, 16, 5 meetings in all in Madrid. Virginia Orbinson's diary read the following. She says, Dorothy, not well, but holding up. According to a history of the faith in Spain that Virginia Orbison was writing, she says, Dorothy conquered all the hearts of those that she met. And that was basically what happened wherever she went, in South America, in the US, and in Europe. Dorothy Loss, who was to become a pioneer of long-standing to Switzerland, wrote from Brussels, where she pioneered in 1947. She said, darling, with your teaching work, with your walk, talks on prayer, your touching stories, and with the 7 valleys, you have started the irrigation of a nearly parched soil in the hearts of your listeners. They really did not know what they lacked so desperately. Your visit has been an invaluable contribution to the first awakening of a nation. Leah Nice, who was the first person to become Baha'i in Belgium, she had learned about the faith from two American pioneers, Jack and Ernest Shirkliff. And she was very active in helping to organize Dorothy's visit in Belgium. She says Dorothy spent 1 week in Brussels in 1948. I didn't know much about her, just that she was a great lady and had done much for the faith, but when she came, we knew she was very impressive. We had been trying to find a way to contact the 50 or more associations in the city which had aims which accorded with one of the Baha'i principles. When Dorothy Baker was to come, this seemed the right chance. I was put in charge of organizing the meeting. It was the first time I had done this sort of thing for a very large meeting. So I contacted a friend who was a very well-known musician, and he made arrangements for a very fine trio to play before the meeting, which was held at the Hotel Atlanta in a large and very lovely meeting room, which could seat about 500 people. So between 400 and 500 attended. Can you imagine, in 1948? So when Dorothy Baker entered the hall, she was like a queen. She was so attractive. She always seemed to be master of any situation. The way she dressed was very different from the way the Belgian woman dressed and was most attractive. When I recall that lady's capacity, it was tremendous. She had a very fascinating power, which was working strongly that evening. She had something very special. We were all ears, absorbing her words, the way she talked, her manner, the gestures she used. Her whole attitude was something I cannot convey. It could not be reproduced. Everybody spoke always, not only of her eloquence and the way she spoke, but the way her expressions, her hands, the way she moved. I guess that's everybody that talks about Dorothy Baker, that's all they mention about her. When I had introduced her to the people, she stood up and greeted the people with Abdu'l-Baha. And then she explained its meaning. She talked about world unity. She stood very straight, and there was a microphone, but she did not use the microphone. Then she talked about life after death and gave many details. It was for me something of a discovery of a different aspect of the teachings. I had never been very concerned about life after death. She really drew it to our attention that we have only one life to get ready for it, that we must be prepared, that we must pray and meditate every day, that we have only once the opportunity to know the manifestation of God on this planet. Within 5 or 6 months of Dorothy Baker's visit, several local assemblies were formed in several different cities. She brought us a lot, and she left a lot. Dorothy's own memories of the same period in Brussels were centered, as were all her recollections of that 1948 trip to Europe, on the Baha'is she met there, not on herself. She wrote, Brussels was the scene of day and night activity with the Hotel de Boic, except for one large downtown meeting, the stage center for peace leaders and the many friends and contacts of the Baha'is. On the last evening, the little parlors overflowed into the hall. A tender note was struck by a Dominican priest recently disrobed for the sake of his conscience. He sat in the farthest row back. A pioneer who had given him a book some months before recognized him and spoke to him. So he said, what do you think now? She asked. He lowered his head for a moment and then replied with unaffected simplicity, I have found the truth. A hero had found Baha'u'llah. In Brussels, Dorothy Baker and John Robarts, who was to become hand of the cause, who had served with her in the National Special Assembly of the US and Canada, were together again on the program for a public meeting. In the morning, Mr. Roberts woke up with laryngitis and a sore throat. He recalled that Dorothy told him, don't worry about it, but get yourself to the meeting anyway. I am I'm to be your chairman. I will not embarrass you, but if even at the last minute you feel that your throat is clearing, you may have an experience that I once had. I had the same sort of throat, but got to the meeting anyway, and suddenly when my turn came to speak, my throat cleared and I addressed the meeting without any trouble. John, just relax. Don't worry about the meeting. Pray, and I will pray with you. So he arrived at the meeting in silence. When Dorothy got to the point of introducing the speaker, she looked over at him. He nodded that she should go ahead with it. Then, to his own amazement, he spoke without any trouble. Later, still astonished at what had happened, Mr. Roberts commented, well, it was Dorothy Baker who got me through that one. A few years later, Mr. Roberts and his wife, Audrey, were named Knights of Baha'u'llah because of their move to Bechuana land in Africa. In 1957, Shoki Effendi appointed John Roberts a hand of the cause of God. Dorothy's trip made her even more sensitive to the sacrifices and confirmations of the Baha'is who leave their homes to settle in new countries with the hope of spreading the teachings of Baha'i. So pioneering is ecstasy and tears, she would say, bad food, cold rooms, dark pension, and periods of fruitless waiting, yearning souls, sudden illumination, an outreaching public and new conviction of the power that is far beyond the ken of man and of angels. From Oslo to Lisbon, the pioneers are singularly suited to their tasks as if by providence ordained to them. But Dorothy was not naive. In the same report on her trip abroad, she proved her understanding of the distance still to be traveled in the work of the faith. She said, Europe is frustrated and often skeptical, living in fear and believing in nothing. But Europe is groping too and in search of a soul. And the part of her that finds it will go to almost any length to keep it. The new believers are the eyes of Europe. They alone can look ahead. To them, the cause is the difference between everything and nothing. So this is now in 1948. 1949, after the European tour, Dorothy set out for the International Teaching Congress in Guatemala. A cable from The Guardian was analyzed by a committee of the Congress, and from his suggested activities, the extend scope teaching, consolidate assemblies. A 2-year plan was drawn up with specific goals. Dorothy was impressed by the diligence and hard work of the Baha'is in Central America and the Antilles. However, the outstanding attainment of this Congress in her mind was the greater understanding which the delegates acquired of the Guardian and a tremendous deepening in their love for him. In 1950, drawn by the goals of the Guardian's second 7-year plan, Dorothy represented the National Special Assembly of the US and the Inter-America Committee at both the Annual Congress for Central America, held this time in El Salvador in April, and the 4th Annual Congress for South America, held in Lima, Peru in May. So while Frank and her mother traveled to Portugal to visit her daughter Louise and her husband, Dorothy boarded a southbound train and stopping here and there. So again, we're going to skip all these trips. She just visited so much. Between 1943 and 1952, she has visited 15 Central American and South American countries. And her influence apparently was great, although she had not spent much time in Central America. Now, in 1951, the National Assembly of Iran wanted to have a record of Dorothy's travel and experience as a Baha'i. I don't know. That's what they wanted. They wanted to know what she had done. So she had to write to them and basically explain what she had done. And she mentioned, she said that she was a member of the NSA from 1937 forward, and chairman from 45 to 49. And then she was, at the time, was vice president. She explained that she was chairman of about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 national committees, in addition to being chairman of the NSA, like the Assembly Development Committee, the Radio Committee, the Race Unity Committee, the National Programming Committee. There's all kinds of committees. And she has been teaching. This is a report she sent to Iran. She did a lot of teaching all over the place in America, South America, in Europe. And she visited tons of countries. She listed all the countries. She visited in Latin America, in Canada, and in Europe. I mean, maybe a total of 50 countries. And then towards the end of her report to Iran, she says she visited 140 colleges and universities where she gave Baha'i lectures, given in assemblies or chapels, most of them leading to classroom discussions or to further lectures by other speakers. And then she concludes with this paragraph. She says, the bounty of Baha'u'llah was first conferred through the faith and generosity of a paternal grandmother. That's her grandmother, Mother Beecher, with whom I visited His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha in the city of New York. Remember, when she was only 12 years old. It is a blessed thing to remember the child who sat entranced at the feet of her Lord and received his all-merciful love. In that hour, all fear was replaced by a passion for all people. Besides this, only one thing remained, that Baha'u'llah is the all-glorious Redeemer and his power is equal to all things. This fixed principle became and still is the fulcrum and pillar of an otherwise impotent life. And then she signs, faithfully in the service of the guardian, Dorothy Baker. Now, that's the summary report she sent to the NSA of Iran. So now we come to just a parenthesis of her personal life with her husband and growing children and how they married and had kids. I just will go through a little bit of this. So while his mother and sister traveled the globe, Bill Baker, and that's the son of Dorothy and Frank, after a year at Yale University, was drafted into the army. So for 3.5 years during the Second World War, he served as an army cook. After the war, he returned to Lima, Ohio to work at his father's bakery. The family was very hopeful that Bill Baker would marry a Baha'i, but the national community was so small and spread out that Dorothy feared he would never have the opportunity to meet many Baha'i girls. So she began to make a point of inviting young ladies to Lima for the weekend so Bill could get to know them. So it was after a visit from a particularly sweet and pretty girl named Anna Marie Mattoon that Dorothy went to the cornerstone room at the Baha'i House of Worship and we met and prayed that Bill would marry. She prayed for God's will, but later confessed that she had her eye on Anna Marie. On December 23rd, 1947, Bill married Anna Marie at her sister's home in Wilmette. Members of the next generation of Baha'is were coming into their own. Anna Marie's sister, Florence Mattoon, had married Otto Zmeskal 7 years before Bill and Marie's wedding. Both Florence and Otto had been students in Dorothy's youth classes in Luhallen. After their wedding, Dorothy wrote to them expressing her tender contemplation of Baha'i marriage. She says, dearest Flossie and Otto. Now this Flossie is the sister of the one her son, Bill married, and Marie. Says, you can't know, and I'm afraid I can never tell you how happy it makes me to write to Baha'i bride and groom, and especially to have it be you, Our Luhallan days together have endeared you both to me. There is no doubt that your home will become a place of attraction and brilliant illumination. I pray that there may be 1,000 marriages like yours. It seems to me that it must be a prototype of the new day of all marriages of the future. So, Dorothy was very close to Florence and Otto, who, after Bill's marriage to Florence's sister, were now family as well as friends. Dorothy spoke to them about her son. She told them that she loved Bill so very much and depended on him. He is like a rock. You can count on Bill. So after his own wedding, Bill Baker went into baking school in Minneapolis, then back to work in their company, which was called Plizol. That's the they make their bread and all that, the family bakery. The 4.5 years he worked for his father were wonderful years for Frank and Dorothy. During their travels, Frank had Bill and Anne-Marie nearby, as well as having his son's able assistance at Plizol. Dorothy adored coming home to such a rich family life. Her mother, Luella, the mother of Dorothy, now lived with them on Elm Street and only 12 miles away at the family farm where her dear son and his bride, Anna-Marie. When Frank's namesake was born to Bill and Anna-Marie on March 5, 1949, Dorothy was overjoyed. She wrote, what happened with these doors? She wrote to Cora Oliver, here in Lima, I have become a grandmother. The darling little boy, Frank Mattoon Baker, has moved into all our hearts. And as you may well imagine, directs 2 households with no effort at all. He's so sweet, and I really do believe will have many of the fine qualities of his 2 namesakes, the grandfather Baker and Mattoon. Bill and Anne-Marie are naturally bursting with pride and joy these days. Now, the other son she had, Conrad, was from the first wife of Frank's husband. He went to Yale University School of Medicine. He married Marjorie Wheeler, and he was an intern. I don't know, it's a long story what happened to him. They finally also moved to Lima, Ohio. And then when the war broke out, Conrad enlisted in the army and served in England, France, Belgium, and Germany. After the war, they came back, and their son, the son of Conrad and his wife, her stepson, her name was Dwight. He remembered years ago what happened when they came back to live with Dorothy and Frank. He said, about 1947, my parents and Anne and I took a trip to Greenacre, and Grandma was there too. She was very busy attending NSA meetings at Rogers Cottage, which had little meaning for me at the time. In 1948, I went to Greenacre with just my father. I remember running and playing one of the big porch on Sarah Farmer Hall, with kids are still doing to this day. During a visit to Lima in 1950, Grandma Dorothy found out that I was interested in radio broadcasting and engineering. So she went to the trouble of arranging for a visit to the transmitter tower of the Lima radio station, then drove me over. They let me stay for most of the afternoon, talking to the engineer on duty and learning about the workings of the radio station. In addition, Dorothy and Frank also purchased a gift subscription to my first electronic publication. That really got me started in what would become my career. So the father, in 1946, Conrad Baker, joined Windham Community Memorial Hospital in Connecticut. And he was the first Baha'i to live there. Now, at that time, there was an epidemic of pneumonia broke out in New England. And he was working as anesthesiologist on the staff. So he was on call like 24 hours a day. Among those who became ill were his 2 children. They were called Dwight and Anne. So Conrad successfully treated them both with penicillin, which was a fairly new approach to treatment of the disease back then. But when Conrad himself, the doctor, caught pneumonia, the rampage had seen a widespread that the hospital ran out of penicillin. So Conrad Baker died on November 13th, 1948, at the age of 39. A devastation for his young family. And he was buried in Windham. Can you just imagine, because they ran out of penicillin for himself. He died and he saved his kids. I mean, I can't believe that, you know, a great doctor, anesthesiologist at the age of 39. It's awful. So during that period, her adored friend, Louis Gregory, had died. So this is back in 48 or something. With other devoted admirers of the man Shoki Effendi called dearly beloved, noble-minded, golden-hearted Louis Gregory, Dorothy deeply mourned his passing. In a cable from Haifa, the Guardian conferred the rank of Hand of the Cause of God on Louis Gregory. Those assembled at the Louis Gregory Memorial Service in Wilmette heard of his outstanding service to the Baha'i faith. Dorothy officiated at the gathering and recounted some of the many ways Louis gave his life, 14 years as a member of the NSA, between 22 and his retirement in 1946, and annual participation in college teaching projects and race amity work. To the Baha'is assembled that November day, his appointment as a Hand of the Cause of God must have seemed the natural outcome of a life of sacrificial service. So,
Because it's boring.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So in addition to the personal hurt, no, at that time, something happened. There were some rumors spread surrounding Dorothy. And don't know what those rumors were, but he was speaking with she was speaking to someone, and she said something like, I feel like getting out of the teaching work and let it all go and go back to being a housewife. I don't know what happened that made her feel so disheartened. You know, what were those rumors? It is not explained. But in addition to the personal hurt Dorothy felt from the cruel and untrue gossip of some individuals, her pain and anxiety were increased as she was called upon to perform a service she felt unsure that she could remember. And it has to do with, in one of the countries that Dorothy visited, a woman had a strong dislike for a young pioneer. And so the woman was determined to have the young man declare the covenant breaker. And the NSA of that area took the boy's rights away. So Dorothy was asked to inform the pioneer, and she was very distressed. So the story is that, you know, she didn't welcome that function, but she had to do it. She tried to explain to him that, you know, there was no point in him leaving the country just because that was a decision of the NSA. He should obey the institutions and try to continue working and teaching. And he started teaching. He didn't stop teaching. And because of him, he was going from city to city. Apparently, in a span of a year, he was able to form 7 new local spiritual assemblies in each of the 7 towns that he visited. And within that year, of course, his rights were given. And so that made the point that, as Dorothy Baker says, that you've got to believe and obey the institutions all the time. She says, Dorothy Baker said later that because she obeyed, she could see that he was strengthened and assisted by her action, and he too obeyed fully. Notes taken from one of her talks show her concern for obedience to the institutions and the thoughts on which her actions were no doubt rooted. She said the institutions formed the embryonic basis for God's new world order and future world divine civilization, and are the main channel through which guidance and blessings flow to the believers. They have great spiritual power, the power of the covenant, which comes from God. Unity depends upon firmly adhering, loyally upholding, and lovingly obeying these divinely ordained institutions. So Dorothy Baker obeyed the institutions, though it was a very difficult situation for her. So soon after this incident, in December 1951, he received a call from Edna True from the National Baha'i Center. And it was about a cable that had been received from the Guardian. The scope of the Guardian's cable was tremendous, covering the superstructure, the Baha'i Bab Sepulchre, the International Baha'i Council, various historic sites in the Holy Land, and the 4 upcoming international conferences. Edna did not read all of it, but quoted the last point. She said, quoting the Guardian, "Our now ripe, take long, inevitably deferred step, conformity provisions, Abdu'l-Baha's testament, conjunction with 6 above mentioned steps through appointment of first contingent of hands of the cause of God." So Edna started reading the message. She says, the names of the 3 hands in the Holy Land were read, then the 3 in Persia, then those for the American continent, and she started reading Horace Holly, Dorothy Baker, and then Dorothy interrupted. "Wait, Eddie, you're kidding." Edna repeated the news again and again as Dorothy continued to insist it was a practical joke. Dorothy was sure that it had to be a hoax. As Edna True recalled, she had to insist again. She said, "I'm not kidding." "Yes, you are. You're kidding. You must be. Please be serious, Dorothy. I'm not kidding. You've got to be. There's no reason why the Guardian would appoint me. Eddie, I think that means you." "No, he doesn't. There's no chance of a mistake here." So that was the first historic appointment of 12 hands of the cause of God. And in Europe, America, and you probably know, I took down the names of all these hands of the cause. Even Leroy Iowas, who was the 3rd hand of the cause named from the US, when Leroy Iowas went to Canada to speak to them, he says he came to our NSA meeting and we all gazed at him. Here was a first living hand of the cause, a being from another world. And he looked at us and said with tears in his voice, "Oh, don't look at me like that, you know. We used to think that the hands of the cause were those glorious beings before whom we would have to bow down. And now we find out they're just like me, like I am." And he broke down and wept. Then he said, when Dorothy heard, she lost her voice. And when Dorothy loses her voice, the birds stop singing. The world is silent. Yeah, Dorothy described the shock she felt in letters to friends, family, and Baha'i institutions around the world. But as the days passed, there were signs of her growing assurance and understanding, and finally of the eagerness she felt to begin a completely new epoch. That's it, you know, that's what happens. This is something that had not happened before in the time of the Guardian. Those hands were named posthumously, and this is the first contingent that was named. So as we close this section of her life, of course, she must have written to her family and everybody. She wrote to the Baha'is of Luxembourg to inform them. She says, "Beloved friends, your fragrant letter brought back so plainly the beautiful city of Luxembourg, and my heart leaped across the sea to embrace you all in your wonderful work for the blessed kingdom. I often think with intense gratitude of the visit to Europe and my precious association with you all. How glorious it has been to watch you progress and what sturdy believers Europe can boast today, to say nothing of her promise for the future. I beg you all to pray that in these soul-shaking days, we who have been appointed to the new responsibilities incumbent upon the hands may be enabled to so serve our revered guardian as to bring increasing joy to his overburdened heart. This is our common prayer and whole desire. Knowing your love and depth of understanding, I can, with the greatest assurance, ask you to share in it." The appearance of these institutions is still another sign to us all that the faith can now sustain outwardly and inwardly the impact of world recognition and world admiration. God be praised that you and I have been privileged to see this. Please give dear friends of the Luxembourg community most loving greetings. May we meet together many times and each time with a greater victory to offer. So this was December 1951. And of course, life is slowly coming to an end. So again, she had to go to South America. She had to print this. It's so long. So I'm going to skip some of the stories because it may not be very interesting for all of you. There was a particularly stormy session at one of the conventions which she was in, and she was with Muriel, a very good friend of hers, who was at the convention but was not as a delegate. She was sitting next door in a room next to the meeting, and she was doing some typing for the National Assembly. This room had been prepared to hold the sacred relics that Baha'u'llah's hair was lying there in a frame, together with some small things of Abdu'l-Baha and some sacred writings, and the room was decorated with flowers and pictures. It was like a shrine. Suddenly, Dorothy came in from the convention room. I could see that she was agitated, though she talked calmly enough. She walked around, touching this and that. Suddenly, at some word I uttered to the effect that it was sad that some would have to leave the convention early and would not be able to hear a particular message which she was to bring, she began pacing up and down and praying aloud. I felt that I was just no longer present in her consciousness as she prayed with tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking, calling out again and again to Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, and Shawki Effendi. She knelt down and clasped the blessed hair of Baha'u'llah to her breast and cried for help. She was in agony, and her agony was entirely for the beloved cause. Her whole suffering was for the unity of the believers and their progress. Her words, though not loud, rang in the room and echoed and re-echoed, and I felt such a presence that I cannot describe it. Finally, she stood calm, smiling, serene, and went into the convention room, and there was a new peace there immediately. At the close of the incident, Dorothy looked at me with a world of emotion in her eyes. She said, "This is between you and me, isn't it, Muriel?" And I gave her my word, except that I could share it with my husband. Now perhaps I am released from that promise. I'm sure if it would do any good, Dorothy would release me. She, when she prayed, she would just go into this emotions and this powerful trance that would just transform her. Margot Miesler, who was a pioneer in South America, following a talk in Buenos Aires, Dorothy placed great emphasis on the dispensation of Baha'u'llah by the Guardian. She says, the Guardian pleads with us to speak of the greatness of the cause, its world scope. He begs us to give it prestige. Do not speak of it as if it were your own little personal philosophy. It is the salvation of God for this day, and without it, the planet becomes non-existent. Mrs. Baker explained that teaching falls into three categories, of which the first is the fire of attraction, and every single believer is responsible for this. But this is only the first step. The experience of the heart is important, but it is not enough. Now the Guardian has said that the basic study of Baha'u'llah in the new era is necessary And that for the third stage, preparation for membership, we have the dispensation of Baha'u'llah and the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha. Now, I think we do not realize the importance of the dispensation. If you could all go home and tell the believers in your community this, that just as the Aqdas was the book of laws and gave us the laws, the succession and the institutions of the faith, and the will and testament of the Baha was the charter of the world order, so the dispensation of Baha'u'llah by the Shaykh Effendi has its place, for it stands as the testament of the guardian. In it, he plainly defines the place of the guardianship in relation to the world order. It is interesting, in the absence of an actual will at the time of the guardian's death, 5 years later, that Dorothy Baker called the dispensation of Baha'u'llah the guardian's testament. That's just her way of interpreting the value of that document. So, now we're slowly coming to almost to the end of the travels of Dorothy Baker. Before we close the chapter of Dorothy Baker's life, there were the 4 congresses, the 4 World Intercontinental Conferences that the Guardian sent all the hands of the cause to Africa, to America, to Europe, and to India to prepare the world in this year, the year of Jubilee, 1952 to 53, before the 10-year crusade. So I don't know if I should just stop here and try to conclude maybe next week on the last few years of Dorothy Baker, because before that, she was finally invited. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Just do
Hmm? Yeah. So the last 4 conferences, she was in Kampala, and she had visited the Guardian. Finally, went on pilgrimage that had been delayed for many years, and she was only able to stay 7 days. She was surprised that the Guardian did not give her a specific plan for an action plan for the years to come. The Guardian did not mention anything specific. And she had to go to Kampala, and she had to go to India. And so Rohia Khanum, the day before she left the Holy Land to go to the rest of these conferences, went to talk to her, and she was, she knew she was disappointed that she didn't really get to spend much time with the Guardian, but she was not upset. She just said that with the Guardian, when you come to pilgrimage, you're like a sponge. You're just totally dry, and if you just spend with him the time that you spend with him, you leave like the sponge is completely filled with water, and there's nothing more you can say, nothing more you can do, and you can't basically complain. You've been refilled totally. And so she was basically happy to. So during that period, she had, with her husband, decided that they were going to pioneer to the Windward Islands, and they were making plans to do all that. And she had barely finished. Her her visit to India and was about to return to the States. And she took a plane and was expected to land in England. And they stopped in Italy to catch the next flight to go to England. And just to conclude, so we don't keep talking about Dorothy Baker. Her flight, she was in a plane, was a Comet, and she loved those planes. And she just landed in Rome, and she was about to board again because she was expected in England a few hours later. She was able to mail a few reports to the Guardian, and the plane took off, and within minutes after the plane took off, the plane exploded. And that's the end of her life. You know, that there was a fisherman that was close by that island, heard the 3 explosions, and he saw parts of the craft coming down, and that was the end. That was the end of their life. That was such a shock to the Baha'i world, and that saddened tremendously the Guardian. And you know, there is a quote from her that her daughter remembered years before, when she says, as Dad and her mother and Bill and I sat in a small sala in the Hotel Massimo, feeling as though this were somehow the ultimate deprivation, I suddenly recalled the day almost 20 years earlier. Dad and I sat at the Pullman table when Mother came in after taking some friends to the train station who had come to Lima to visit Mother Beecher's grave. Mother dropped into her chair at the end of the table, and after talking for a few minutes about the visit, suddenly said with considerable heat, I hope people don't make a shrine of my grave after I'm buried. Dad chuckled and asked, and how can you make sure that they won't? Mother considered a moment and then answered, if I could really have my choice, I would be buried at sea. Later, Mother added, and if I could choose the sea, then it would be the Mediterranean, whose waves will lap eternally on the shores of Akka. That's what she said 20 years ago, 20 years before her death. Her life ended 3 years after she was named the Hand of the Cause of God. Anyway, my friends, so much to say, you have to sort of skip because it's getting, don't want to tire you and bore you, but you know, you can see from her life that is very rarely will you see a Baha'i that is so imbued with the writings and who believes in prayer. She lived in a state of prayer, basically. And she accomplished so much in the teaching world, the teaching field and the administrative field. I mean, she was just an exceptional person. We sort of sorry that we don't have images of her speaking, so we can just listen to a complete talk of Dorothy Baker from the beginning.